Have you ever stared out at the horizon, at that perfect, clean line where the sea meets the sky, and felt a powerful urge to know what mysteries lie just beyond your sight? It is a deep and ancient calling, a whisper in the human soul that has driven us to climb the highest mountains, to cross the most forbidding deserts, and to sail into the vast, unknown oceans. We are going to journey back to a time when the world map was filled with vast, blank spaces, a time when sailing west meant disappearing over the very edge of the known world. It was an age of myth and wonder, where the sea was a place of monsters and miracles, and the horizon was not a destination, but a finality. As we begin our shared journey tonight, I'm always so curious to know where our stories are reaching. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is wonderful to imagine our community of scribes stretching across the globe. Now, find a comfortable position, let your body relax, and allow the gentle sounds of the past to guide you into a state of peaceful rest. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we join a man whose dream was so immense it would either lead to legendary glory or a watery grave. Our story begins not on the open ocean, but in the heart of a powerful kingdom, where a persistent mariner sought to convince a king and queen to fund an impossible voyage. His name was Cristoforo Colombo, a man we now know as Christopher Columbus. And he carried with him an idea that was both brilliantly simple and dangerously wrong. He was a mariner from Genoa, a man whose skin was weathered by the sun and sea of the Mediterranean. He was not a prince or a nobleman, but the son of a wool weaver, possessed by an unshakable conviction. In the late 15th century, most educated people understood that the world was a sphere. The question was not about its shape, but about its size. And it was here that Columbus made his grand, magnificent mistake, poring over ancient texts by candlelight, the faint, sweet smell of melting wax filling his small study. He pieced together his version of the globe. He read the works of the ancient geographer Ptolemy and the recent sensational accounts of Marco Polo's travels to the Far East. He traced his fingers over maps drawn on old parchment, the paper crackling softly under his touch. From these sources, he stitched together a theory. He concluded that the Earth was much smaller than it actually was, and that the great eastern continent of Asia was far larger, stretching its fingers much further east than anyone had previously imagined. The result of this miscalculation was a belief that the distance from the western shores of Europe to the fabled Spice Islands of the East Indies was not an impossible expanse, but a manageable voyage of only a few thousand miles. He believed he could reach the land of gold and spices by sailing west, a direct route, a shortcut to unimaginable wealth. With this conviction burning in his heart, he first took his proposal to the most powerful maritime nation of the day, Portugal. In 1485, he stood before King John II, a shrewd and experienced monarch who had sponsored many voyages down the coast of Africa. Columbus unrolled his charts, his voice earnest as he explained his calculations. But the king's own experts, the finest mariners and cosmographers in his service, listened with skepticism. They checked his figures, consulted their own charts, and came to a different conclusion. The ocean, they declared, was far too vast. Columbus had underestimated the journey by a staggering amount. His plan was not just risky, it was suicidal. The king, trusting his advisors, politely but firmly rejected the proposal. It was a crushing blow, But for a man like Columbus, it was merely a delay. So, he turned his gaze to Portugal's great rival, Spain. But here, he found a nation with other priorities. The Spanish monarchs, the famously devout Queen Isabella of Castile, and the cunning King Ferdinand of Aragon, were consumed by a centuries-old struggle. They were in the final bloody stages of the Reconquista, the long war to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from the Moorish kingdoms. Their focus, their treasury, and their armies were all directed south towards the last remaining Muslim stronghold, the magnificent emirate of Granada. For years, Columbus became a familiar, almost permanent fixture in the Spanish court. He was a man in waiting, a petitioner, following the royals as they moved from one fortified city to another. He would have spent countless hours in antechambers, the feel of the worn leather on the chairs a familiar discomfort. He would listen to the rustle of royal garments as nobles swept past him and hear the endless courtly whispers, wondering if any of them were about him, about his mad idea. The air in these castles was a mix of incense from the chapels, the sweat of soldiers, and the intricate, fragrant spices used in the royal kitchens, a constant reminder of the very riches he promised to find. He presented his case again and again, his arguments refined by years of late-night study, his proposals smelling of old parchment and the sealing wax that held his dreams together. But the answer was always the same. Wait, Spain was at war. There was no time, no money for such a gamble. Years passed, his hair grew grayer, but his resolve never wavered. He watched as Spanish knights, clad in shining armor, rode out for the final assault on Granada. He saw the intricate Moorish architecture of the cities they conquered, a testament to the wealth and sophistication of the enemy they sought to defeat. This, too, must have fueled his ambition, a vision of the even greater riches that lay across the sea. Finally, in the first days of 1492, the impossible happened. The city of Granada fell. The war was over. The Spanish flag flew over the Alhambra palace, and the monarchs were victorious. Suddenly, the world had changed. The royal treasury, though drained by the long war, was now free from its greatest burden. The attention of Isabella and Ferdinand could turn to other matters, to new opportunities for glory and gold. This was the moment Columbus had waited for. With the help of a few influential allies at court, most notably the royal treasurer, Luis de Santangle, he pressed his case one last time. Santangle, a practical man who understood finance, saw the potential. He argued forcefully to Queen Isabella that the investment was relatively small compared to the potential reward. He painted a picture of new lands, new souls for the church, and a treasury overflowing with Eastern gold, enough to fund a new crusade to Jerusalem. He convinced her that the risk was worth taking, and so, after 7 long years of persistence, the monarchs agreed. In April of 1492, in the captured city of Santa Fe, they signed a remarkable document. It was known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe. This was not just a funding agreement. It was a contract of staggering ambition. It granted this Genoese mariner, this commoner, the hereditary title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was to be the Viceroy and Governor-General of all new lands he might discover and claim for Spain. And most astonishingly, he and his heirs were promised 10% of all revenues from these new lands. All the gold, silver, pearls, and spices forever. It was a reward of almost unimaginable scale, a testament to either his incredible powers of persuasion or the monarch's belief that he would simply never return. The total cost of the expedition was set at about 2 million maravedis, a considerable sum, but not an impossible one. Part of it was funded by the crown, covered by a loan from Santangle's associates, and the rest was put up by private Italian investors, who also saw a chance for fantastic profit. With royal sanction finally secured, the abstract dream had to become a concrete reality. Columbus now faced his next great challenge, finding the ships and the men willing to sail with him into the abyss. His journey now took him from the gilded halls of royal power to the noisy, chaotic, and practical world of a seaport. He arrived in the small port town of Palos de la Frontera, a community of tough, experienced sailors on the southwestern coast of Spain. Here, the abstract lines on his maps had to be translated into timber, canvas, and rope. The first task was to acquire the ships. Fortune smiled on him in an unusual way. As it happened, the town of Palos owed a debt to the crown. For some past transgression, they had been ordered to provide 2 armed caravels for royal service for a period of 1 year. Columbus arrived, bearing a royal decree demanding his 2 ships. The 2 vessels provided were the Nina and the Pinta. They were caravels, the pinnacle of ship design for the age of exploration. They were not enormous vessels. In fact, they were shockingly small, likely not much more than 50 feet long. But they were nimble, fast, and brilliantly designed. Their key feature was their use of triangular lateen sails, a technology borrowed from Arab sailors. These sails allowed a ship to sail much more effectively against the wind, giving them a maneuverability that older, square-rigged ships lacked. They were perfect for nosing along unknown coastlines and navigating unpredictable waters. Their official names were the Santa Clara and the Painted One, but they would be known to history by their affectionate nicknames. But Columbus needed a third ship, a flagship, to serve as his command vessel. For this, he chartered a larger, heavier vessel, owned by a local cartographer named Juan de la Cosa. This ship was a type of merchant vessel. Her original name was La Gallega, but she would be rechristened the Santa Maria. She was slower and clumsier than the caravels, a rounded, sturdy workhorse of the sea. But her size, perhaps 60 feet long, made her more suitable for carrying the bulk of the provisions and for serving as the admiral's headquarters. Now the immense logistical task began. The port of Palos came alive with activity. The air, thick with the taste of salt water, was now also filled with the sharp, clean smell of freshly cut pine wood and the pungent, acrid aroma of hot tar. Shipwrights swarmed over the vessels, their hammers and saws creating a constant, rhythmic clamor. They were caulking the hulls, stuffing ropes soaked in tar between the wooden planks to make them watertight. On the bustling docks, massive coils of thick, rough rope lay waiting, alongside bolts of heavy canvas that would be cut and stitched into sails. The summer sun beat down on the wooden decks, making the fresh tar soft and sticky underfoot. The holds of the 3 ships had to be filled with everything needed for a voyage of completely unknown duration. Columbus planned for a full year at sea. Casks of fresh water were rolled aboard, along with even more casks of wine, which was considered safer to drink over long periods than stagnant water. Barrels of olive oil, sacks of flour, and crates of salted meat and fish were carefully stowed away. The staple food for any sailor was hardtack, a simple biscuit made of flour, water, and salt, baked multiple times until it was as hard as a rock. It was nearly indestructible and would last for months, though it often became infested with weevils. To supplement this diet, live animals were brought on board. the squealing of pigs and the clucking of chickens added to the port's noisy symphony. A small, floating farm to provide fresh meat for as long as possible. Beyond food, they needed goods for trade. No one knew who they might meet in the Far East, but based on the tales of other travelers, they packed crates with items they believed would be valuable. Simple glass beads of bright colors, tiny brass bells that made a cheerful tinkling sound, and red woolen caps. These were small, cheap trinkets in Europe, but perhaps they would be exotic treasures in the lands of the Great Khan. And just in case their welcome was not a friendly one, the ships were armed. Small cannons, called lombards, were mounted on the decks, their iron barrels pointing out over the rails, a stark reminder that this voyage was not just one of discovery, but also of conquest. All told, the fleet would carry about 90 men, 90 souls spread across 3 tiny wooden ships, preparing to sail into a sea of legends. With the ships now ready, bristling with supplies and purpose, the most crucial component was still missing. A crew brave or desperate enough to sail them into uncharted waters. Assembling the men proved to be an even greater challenge than assembling the ships. The moment the purpose of the voyage became known in the taverns and on the docks of Palos, a palpable fear spread through the town. This was not a standard trading run to England or a familiar fishing trip off the coast of Africa. This was something else entirely. This was sailing west, into the open Atlantic, the ocean sea. To the common sailors of the late 15th century, this was the sea of darkness, an abyss from which no one had ever returned. In the low light of the local taverns, over cups of cheap wine that smelled of vinegar, the sailors spoke in low, murmuring tones. They shared the old stories, the terrifying legends passed down through generations of mariners. They spoke of a point where the sea began to boil, of monstrous krakens with tentacles large enough to drag a whole ship down into the depths. They spoke of sea serpents and ghostly apparitions. And most of all, they spoke of the edge. The common belief was not necessarily that the world was flat like a plate, but that at some point, far to the west, the currents would pull a ship over a catastrophic waterfall at the world's end, or the winds would simply cease, leaving them stranded in a burning, tropical calm until their water ran out. The prospect was terrifying. Who would willingly sign up for such a fate? Initially, very few. Columbus was a foreigner, a Genoese with a strange accent and a wild theory. The local sailors trusted their own experiences, and their experiences told them that safety lay along the coastlines, not in the empty heart of the ocean. Seeing his difficulty, Columbus's patrons at the crown stepped in. A royal decree was issued, offering a full pardon to any convicts in the local prisons who were willing to sign on for the voyage. It was a desperate measure, offering a choice between rotting in a cell and taking a chance on a madman's quest. A few men, with nothing left to lose, accepted the offer. But a crew of convicts and desperate men was not enough. Columbus needed skilled, experienced sailors. The turning point came with the arrival of the Pinthon brothers. They were a respected local family of shipowners and sea captains. The eldest, Martin Alonzo Pinthon, was a wealthy and influential mariner, a man whose opinion carried immense weight in Palos. He had heard of Columbus's theory and, unlike many others, was intrigued by it. After meeting with Columbus and reviewing his charts, Martin Alonzo became a believer. He saw the potential for fame and incredible fortune. He not only agreed to join the expedition, but also invested his own money and brought his 2 brothers with him. Vicente Yanez Pinthon would command the Nina, and Francisco Martin Ponthon would serve as the master of the Pinta, which Martin Alonso himself would captain. The moment the Pinthon brothers signed on, everything changed. Their reputation was sterling. If they were willing to risk their lives and their ships on this voyage, then perhaps it was not so mad after all. Their involvement broke the dam of fear, and recruitment began in earnest. The crew that was finally assembled was a diverse collection of humanity. Most were from the local region of Andalusia, tough men who had spent their lives on the sea. There were experienced pilots, able-bodied seamen, and young cabin boys eager for adventure. There was a royal secretary to record the official proceedings of the voyage, ensuring every discovery was properly documented for the crown. There was a physician to tend to the sick and injured, and an interpreter, a man who was fluent in Hebrew and Arabic. Columbus believed these languages would be useful in the courts of Asia, as described by Marco Polo. The motivations of these men were as varied as their backgrounds. The promise of regular pay, with an advance pressed as a cool coin into a sailor's palm, was a powerful lure for many poor families. The further promise of a share in the untold wealth to be discovered was a siren song for the ambitious. For some, it was a chance to escape a troubled past. For others, it was simply the pursuit of glory, the desire to be part of something historic. And for a few, it was perhaps just a lack of any better options in a hard and unforgiving world. In the final days before departure, a solemn mood settled over the town of Palos. The smell of cheap wine and nervous sweat was thick in the air. On the docks, anxious families gathered for long, tearful goodbyes, mothers holding their sons, wives clinging to their husbands. They knew the odds. They knew they might never see these men again. The night before they were to set sail, Columbus and his entire crew of 90 men walked in a solemn procession to the local church of St. George the Martyr. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the scent of old stone and beeswax. In the flickering candlelight, they knelt. The solemn silence was broken only by the priest's Latin chants as they all took confession and received communion. They were making their peace with God, treating this voyage as a potentially final act, entrusting their souls to a higher power before they entrusted their bodies to the merciless sea. The ships were prepared, the crews assembled, and the final prayers had been said. All that remained was to cast off the lines and commit their fates to the sea. The dawn of August 3rd, 1492, broke gray and quiet over the port of Palos. In the pre-dawn darkness, the 90 men of the expedition made their way to the shore. There were no grand speeches, no cheering crowds. There was only the quiet lapping of the water against the hulls of the 3 ships, bobbing gently on the outgoing tide of the Tinto River. The moment had arrived. On the deck of the Santa Maria, Admiral Columbus gave the order. A chorus of grunts and shouts rose from the men as they began to heave on the capstan bars, walking in a slow circle to raise the heavy anchors. The sound of the anchor chains being hauled up from the riverbed was a final, clanking, metallic sound of connection to the land. Link by link, their ties to the old world were being broken. Slowly, awkwardly, at first, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria turned their bows towards the sea. Their great canvas sails, still folded, were loosed, and they unfurled with a series of loud cracks, catching the early morning breeze. The ships began to move, gliding down the river towards the open ocean. From the shore, the small figures of their families watched, a silent, heartbroken vigil, until the ships were just specks in the distance. Their first destination was not the unknown, but the familiar. they set a course south for the Canary Islands. This Spanish territory, off the coast of Africa, was the last outpost of the known world, a final staging point before the true leap of faith. It was a wise and necessary stop, a chance to reprovision and make any final repairs. And as it turned out, repairs were needed almost immediately. Just a few days into the voyage, a crisis erupted. The rudder of the Pinta, captained by the capable Martin Alonso Pinthon, broke. The heavy wooden steering mechanism had somehow come loose from its mountings, leaving the caravel nearly uncontrollable, wallowing in the ocean swells. Was it an accident, the result of heavy seas, or was it something more? Columbus recorded in his journal that he suspected sabotage. He believed the ship's owners, who had been reluctant to part with their vessel, had deliberately damaged the rudder, hoping the breakdown would force the entire expedition to be called off. Whatever the cause, it was a serious problem. They limped their way to the Canaries, arriving at the island of Grand Canary, where they spent the next 3 weeks. It was a frustrating delay, but also a crucial one. A skilled team of shipwrights was found to repair and strengthen the Pinta's rudder. While the repairs were underway, Columbus took the opportunity to make other improvements. He had been observing the performance of his ships, and he decided that the Nina, with her triangular lateen sails, was too slow in the steady winds they had encountered. On the island of La Gomera, he ordered her rig to be changed. The lateen sails were replaced with square sails, making her better suited for running before the trade winds that he correctly predicted would blow them steadily west across the open ocean. It was a decision that showed his skill and experience as a practical seaman. Finally, after a month of repairs and refitting, the fleet was ready once more. The casks were topped off with fresh water, and the last supplies were brought aboard. A communal cheer likely went up from the sailors, a moment of temporary victory and restored confidence. On the 6th of September, they weighed anchor for the last time. They sailed past the final island, the volcanic peak of El Hierro. For hours, the men watched as its familiar shape grew smaller and smaller on the eastern horizon. They stared until the green of its hills faded to a hazy blue, and the blue became a faint line, and then it was gone, slipped below the curve of the earth. In that moment, for the first time, they were truly alone. They were surrounded on all sides by an endless, empty expanse of blue water. There was nothing, no landmarks, no other ships, no sign of life, but the seabirds that followed them. This was the moment that all the sailors had dreaded. This was the sea of darkness. The reality of their undertaking crashed down upon them, and the logbook records that many of the tough, hardened sailors wept openly. They cried for the homes and families they had left behind, and for the terrifying, unknown future that lay before them. Columbus, standing on the stern castle of the Santa Maria, set his course due west. He would follow the 28th parallel, a line of latitude he believed would lead him directly to the islands of Japan. A steady wind from the northeast filled their new square sails, a powerful, reliable force, pushing them away from everything they had ever known. The crisp, clean smell of the sea, unpolluted by any trace of land, filled their lungs. As the last trace of the old world vanished behind them, the 90 men aboard 3 small ships faced their new reality, an endless expanse of blue water in every direction. Their lives were now governed by the rhythms of the sea, the wind, and the stars. The courage to leave the shore is a powerful thing. Have you ever taken a leap of faith into the unknown in your own life? It's fascinating to think about what drives us to explore. As the last trace of the old world vanished behind them, the 90 men aboard 3 small ships faced their new reality. It was an endless expanse of blue water in every direction. Their lives were no longer governed by the rhythms of the land, by the rising and setting of the sun over familiar hills, but by the entirely different pulse of the deep ocean. They had sailed into a void, a floating world with its own rules, its own sounds, and its own unforgiving routines. Life on board was a world of wood, rope, and canvas, a tiny, self-contained universe constantly in motion. The fundamental rhythm of their existence was marked not by a clock tower, but by the soft, steady whisper of sand. A young ship's boy had the most important job on the vessel. He was the keeper of the Ampelita, a simple hourglass filled with enough sand to mark the passing of 30 minutes. His duty, every half hour, day and night, was to turn the glass and call out to the crew. His young voice, a constant reminder of the slow, relentless march of time. The ship's bell would ring, marking the end of a watch. The crew was divided into 2 watches. For 4 hours, one group would be on duty, their hands raw from hauling on thick, abrasive ropes, their eyes scanning the horizon, their bodies constantly braced against the rolling of the deck. They would trim the sails, swab the decks, and keep the ship on course. The other group was off duty, but rest was a luxury that was hard to find. For the common sailor, there were no dedicated sleeping quarters, no hammocks, no beds. Only the Admiral Columbus had the privacy of a small cabin. The men slept wherever they could find a sliver of space on the hard wooden deck, curled up amongst coils of rope, or huddled beneath the forecastle to shelter from the wind and spray. Sleep was a fleeting thing, always interrupted by the changing of the watch or the need to respond to a sudden shift in the wind. The ship itself was a living thing, and it had a voice. A constant groaning symphony of creaking timbers became the soundtrack to their lives. Every swell of the ocean, every gust of wind, would make the wooden planks of the hull strain and complain, a sound that was at first unnerving, but soon became as natural as breathing. Their bodies, too, had to learn a new way of being, constantly adjusting to the endless rocking and swaying of the ship. A sailor's walk was a practiced art, a balanced dance on a perpetually moving floor. The smells of this floating world were overwhelming. There was the clean, sharp scent of salt from the sea spray, but this was quickly overpowered by the less pleasant aromas of life in a confined space. The smell of 90 unwashed bodies, of damp clothes that never truly dried, of stale bilge water sloshing in the bottom of the ship, and of the cooking fire. Hygiene was an impossible dream. Fresh water was far too precious for washing, and so the men lived in their own filth. Lice were a constant companion, and the close quarters meant that any sickness could spread like wildfire. To relieve themselves, the sailors had to carefully make their way to the bow of the ship, to a small wooden seat that hung precariously over the waves, a terrifying prospect in rough seas. Food was a simple, monotonous, and often grim affair. The main meal of the day was served at midday, cooked on deck in a simple firebox, a metal container filled with sand. In bad weather, the fire would be extinguished, and the men would eat their food cold. The staples were salted beef or pork, cured to last for months, and hardtack biscuits. These biscuits were the true foundation of their diet. They were so hard they were often called tooth dullers, and the sailors would have to soak them in water or wine to make them edible. But even then, they often had to be eaten in the dark, so that a man would not see the weevils and maggots that had inevitably infested the flour. This was supplemented by dried beans or chickpeas, boiled into a tasteless mush. Water was the most precious and problematic commodity. It was stored in wooden casks, but after weeks at sea, it would become foul. Algae would grow, turning it slimy and green, and it would take on the foul taste of the wood. To make it drinkable, it was often mixed with the ship's other essential beverage, wine. More wine was brought on board than water, as it kept longer and was considered a vital source of calories and morale for the crew. Each man received a daily ration, a small comfort in a hard life. To pass the endless hours, the sailors found simple diversions. They would sit in the sun, mending torn sails with thick needles and waxed thread. They would sing sea shanties, their rough voices rising and falling in rhythm with the waves, songs of home, of lost loves, and of epic sea battles. When the weather was calm, they might cast a line over the side, hoping to catch a fish to supplement their meager diet. And, of course, they would gamble, huddled in small groups, wagering their future pay on games of dice. A desperate attempt to combat the crushing boredom of seeing nothing but the same sun rising and setting over a perfectly flat, empty horizon, day after day after day, while the crew focused on the daily grind of survival, battling boredom and filth. Their admiral was engaged in a constant high-stakes battle of his own. Christopher Columbus was focused on one thing and one thing only: direction. His task was to navigate 3 small ships across a vast, featureless ocean, a challenge that required a delicate blend of science, art, and outright deception. The art of navigation in the 15th century was imprecise at best. The primary and most reliable tool was the mariner's compass, a magnetized needle that floated on a card, always pointing towards magnetic north. This gave Columbus his heading, his direction of travel. But knowing your direction is only half the battle. You must also know your position on the vast grid of the globe. For this, Columbus had tools to measure his latitude, his north-south position. At night, on the high stern castle of the Santa Maria, he would stand, the cool night air a relief from the stuffy confines of his cabin. He would hold up a simple quadrant or a more complex brass astrolabe and squint at the night sky. His goal was to measure the angle of the North Star, Polaris, above the horizon. The height of the star in the sky directly corresponded to the ship's latitude. As long as he could see the North Star, he knew how far north or south he was. But the great, unsolved problem of the age was longitude, the measurement of one's east-west position. There was simply no accurate way to determine it at sea. Clocks were not yet reliable enough to keep accurate time over a long voyage, which was the key to solving the longitude problem. So Columbus had to guess. He relied on a method called dead reckoning. It was a process of estimation. At the end of each day, he would take his last known position, consult the compass to see the direction they had traveled, and then estimate their speed. By calculating direction and speed over time, he could make an educated guess about how far west they had sailed. Estimating the ship's speed was often little more than a form of sophisticated guesswork. A common method was to have a sailor throw a piece of wood or a log off the bow of the ship, and then use the trusty ampelita, the half-hour glass, to time how long it took for the stern of the ship to pass it. From this, a rough calculation of the ship's velocity could be made. It was an inexact science, prone to errors from currents and winds, but it was all they had. In his cabin, by the flickering light of a single candle, Columbus would sit at his small desk. The scratchy sound of his quill pen on parchment would be the only sound, besides the constant creaking of the ship. It was here that he practiced his greatest deception. He knew his crew. He knew their fears. He understood that their courage was a finite resource, and that it was being drained with every passing day that brought no sight of land. He feared, rightly, that if they knew just how far they truly were from Spain, an astronomical distance for the time, their fear would turn to panic, and panic would turn to mutiny. So, he kept 2 separate logbooks. One log was for his eyes only. In this secret book, he meticulously recorded his true calculations, the ship's actual speed, the real distance he believed they had covered each day. This was his scientific record, his true account of the voyage into the unknown. But he also kept a public log. This was the book he would show to his officers and crew. In this log, he deliberately and consistently falsified the numbers. Each day, he would underreport the distance they had traveled, usually by about 10 to 20%. A journey of 150 miles might be recorded as 120. He was creating a fiction, a comforting lie to shield his men from a terrifying truth. He was shrinking the ocean on paper, hoping to keep their morale from sinking. This deception reveals the immense psychological pressure he was under. He was not just the captain, he was the sole keeper of the mission's vision, a lonely man who had to manage the hopes and fears of 89 other souls. Adding to the crew's anxiety were the very winds that made their journey possible. The trade winds blew with a miraculous consistency, a steady push from the east and northeast that filled their sails and drove them westward at a good speed. It was a sailor's dream, but as the weeks wore on, this blessing began to feel like a curse. The wind never seemed to change. It always blew from behind them, pushing them further and further into the void. A frightening question began to form in the minds of the sailors. If the wind only ever blows west, how will we ever sail back home? Columbus's deception was a necessary gamble, for as the days turned into weeks with no sign of land, the crew's hope began to curdle into fear and anger, and whispers of turning back grew louder. By the beginning of October, the fleet had been at sea for over a month. They had sailed further west than any European had ever sailed before, and lived to tell the tale. They were in a part of the world that did not exist on any map. The initial excitement had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim, simmering anxiety. The men would gather on the deck at night, huddled in small groups, their hushed, angry conversations barely audible over the sound of the wind and waves. They looked at Columbus with a growing suspicion. He was not one of them. He was a foreigner, a Genoese with grand promises and a strange, unwavering confidence that now seemed like madness. Their deepest fear was the wind, the relentless westward wind. They were convinced it was a one-way path to destruction, that they would never be able to sail against it, to return to Spain. Their provisions were dwindling, the water was foul, and their nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The men on the Santa Maria, Columbus's own flagship, began to plot. They spoke of confronting the admiral, of demanding that he turn the ships around. Some of the more desperate men even whispered of a darker plan, to simply throw the Genoese admiral overboard and tell the world that he had fallen in while studying the stars. The tension was a physical thing, a heavy, humid air, thick with unspoken threats. Columbus was aware of the mood. He could see it in the defiant, fearful eyes that stared at him. He could feel the growing insubordination. He was an admiral with no fleet to back him up, a governor with no territory to rule, alone with a crew that was on the verge of rebellion. His authority rested on a knife's edge. He had to rely on his wits, his charisma, and the support of the few men who still believed in him. His most important and most complex relationship was with Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the Pinta. Pinzon was a Spaniard, a respected mariner from their own town of Palos. The crew trusted him in a way they would never trust the foreign Columbus. Pinzon was becoming a rival figure, a natural leader for the discontented sailors. Columbus knew he could not command the fleet without the consent of the Pinzon brothers. He had to negotiate, to reason, to persuade. The confrontations became more open. The crew would gather, a silent, menacing wall of defiance, and demand that they turn back. Columbus, with his unshakable self-confidence, would meet them head-on. He would appeal to their greed, reminding them of the capitulations of Santa Fe, of the 10% of all riches they were promised. He would appeal to their ambition, speaking of the glory they would win, their names recorded in history. And he would appeal to their faith, telling them they were doing God's work, destined to bring the light of Christianity to the pagans of the East. But by October 10th, talk was no longer enough. The situation was desperate. The crew was on the verge of open mutiny. Columbus was forced to strike a deal. He stood before his men and made a solemn promise. He asked them for 3 more days. If they did not sight land in 3 days, he swore an oath that he would abandon the quest and turn the ships around, setting a course for home. It was a massive gamble. He was betting everything on the hope that his flawed calculations were not as wrong as his crew feared. The men, reluctantly, agreed. A tense, fragile truce settled over the fleet. 3 days. The hourglass had been turned on the entire expedition, just as the crew's resolve reached its breaking point, as the whispers of mutiny became a roar. The ocean itself began to change. Their journey entered a new and bizarre phase, transforming their despair into a fragile, tormented anticipation. One day, the sailors awoke to an incredible sight. As far as the eye could see, the deep blue of the ocean had been replaced by a vast, eerie, green-gold carpet. They had sailed into a sea of seaweed. This was the Sargasso Sea, a massive, slow-rotating gyre in the North Atlantic, where currents had gathered immense mats of floating sargassum weed for millennia. They had never seen anything like it. The ships plowed through the thick vegetation, the soft, rustling sound a strange new addition to the creaking of the ship. Fear immediately gripped the crew. The old legends spoke of a sea of sludge that could trap a ship forever. They feared they would become hopelessly entangled. Their ships held fast until they starved. But Columbus, ever the optimist, saw something different. He had read that such weeds often grew near coastlines. He declared to his men that this strange sea was not a trap, but a definitive sign that land was near. Hope, a dangerous and volatile emotion, began to flicker in the hearts of the men. And then the false sightings began. A lookout, his eyes strained from staring at the horizon, would mistake a low-lying bank of clouds for the distant shore. "Tiara, Tiara," he would cry. "Land, land." The shout would electrify the ship. Men would scramble up the rigging, their hearts pounding with elation. But as the hours passed, the island would dissolve into vapor, and the collective joy would crash into bitter, soul-crushing disappointment. This happened several times, a cruel psychological torture for the weary sailors. On September 25th, Martin Alonso Pinzon himself, from the deck of the faster Pinta, was certain he saw land to the southwest. He shouted the news across the water to Columbus. The signal was given, and on all three ships, the crews fell to their knees and sang the Gloria, a hymn of praise and thanksgiving. But the next day's sun rose on an empty horizon. There was nothing there. The despair that followed was deeper than ever. Yet, other, more reliable signs began to appear. They started seeing birds, not the seabirds that could live for months on the open ocean, but smaller birds, terns and boobies, that were known to roost on land. Columbus noted in his journal that the air itself began to feel different. It lost its harsh, salty edge and became soft and fragrant, smelling, as he wrote, as sweet as in April in Seville. Then, on October 7th, a truly momentous event occurred. The men saw vast flocks of birds, thousands of them, flying purposefully from the northeast to the southwest. Columbus, a keen observer of nature, knew that birds often migrate between islands or from continents to islands. He made a crucial, intuitive decision. He altered his course from due west and ordered the fleet to follow the birds. 4 days later, on October 11th, the signs became sudden, frequent, and undeniable. The crew of the Nina fished something out of the water. It was a small green branch, and on it was a single, fresh flower, a type they had never seen before. It was impossible for such a plant to have survived for long in the salt water. It must have come from land, and recently. Later that day, the crew of the Pinta found something even more astonishing. It was a piece of cane, a reed, and a small board. And then, the most electrifying discovery of all, a stick that had clearly been worked by a tool, carved by a human hand. The stick was passed from man to man, a tangible, physical piece of evidence. There were people out there. They were not sailing into a void. They were approaching a new world. The mutinous mood vanished in an instant, replaced by a feverish, sleepless anticipation. Every eye was now fixed on the western horizon, waiting, watching for the glimpse of something that would change the world forever. That feeling of seeing a hopeful sign after a long struggle is universal. What small sign has ever given you the strength to keep going? It is remarkable how a tiny flower on a branch could change history. With undeniable proof that land was just ahead, the mutinous mood that had poisoned the fleet for weeks vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a feverish, sleepless anticipation. Every eye was now fixed on the western horizon, waiting for the glimpse that would change the world. The sun set on October 11th, and the 3 small ships sailed on under a brilliant moon. The night was clear, the winds were favorable, and the sea was calm. A path of shimmering silver light lay across the waves, pointing the way forward. The air itself felt different, thick with promise. It was still cool and damp, the familiar feeling of the sea against the sailor's skin. But now it seemed to carry a new scent. It was a faint, almost imperceptible aroma, something other than pure salt. It was the smell of damp earth, of living vegetation, of a world of soil and roots and flowers, a fragrance they had not experienced for more than a month. The familiar sounds of the ship, the endless creaking of the timbers, and the gentle flap of the sails were now sounds of promise, the rhythm of a journey reaching its final, magnificent conclusion. After the evening prayers, the traditional singing of the Salve Regina, Columbus gathered the crew of the Santa María on the deck. In the pale moonlight, his face was a mask of intense seriousness and profound certainty. He spoke to them, not as a commander on the verge of mutiny, but as a prophet whose vision was about to be fulfilled. He reminded them of the immense grace God had shown them by bringing them safely across such a long and perilous sea. He then reminded them of their deal and of the promise of a reward. He declared that he felt so certain that they would make landfall that very night that he offered a personal prize, a fine silk jacket, to the first man who laid eyes on the new world. This, on top of the lifetime annuity of 10,000 maravedis promised by the Queen. With that, he dismissed them to their watch, and an electric vigilance settled over the entire fleet. No one on board was sleeping. Every man was a watcher in the dark. Columbus himself climbed to the stern castle, the high, raised deck at the back of the ship, his traditional place of command and observation. He stared west, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the moonlit water. The hours crept by. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, around 10 o'clock in the evening. As he stood, scanning the horizon, he saw it, or he thought he saw it. It was a flicker of light, incredibly faint and distant. He described it in his journal as being like a small wax candle, rising and falling, appearing and disappearing. It was so indistinct, so uncertain, that he did not dare to declare it as land. He called for Pedro Gutierrez, a gentleman of the king's bedchamber, and asked him if he could see it. Gutierrez peered into the darkness and said that yes, he could see the light. Encouraged, Columbus then called for the royal secretary, Rodrigo Sanchez, the man tasked with officially recording the voyage. But by the time Sanchez reached the stern castle, the light had vanished. He saw nothing. Was it real? Was it a fire on a distant shore, perhaps in a canoe of local fishermen? Or was it just a trick of the light on the water, a phantom created by weary, hopeful eyes? For centuries, historians have debated what Columbus saw, but for the admiral himself, it was a private confirmation. He felt in his bones that they were close. The fleet sailed on, the Pinta being the fastest and lightest of the three ships, sailing ahead of the others, its crew eager to claim the prize. Columbus, ever the cautious mariner, felt the immense risk of approaching an unknown coastline in the dark. He gave an order that must have seemed counterintuitive to his excited crew. He ordered them to shorten sail, to slow the ships down, to proceed with caution lest they run aground on unseen reefs or rocks. The mood on the ships was one of almost unbearable tension. Every sound, every shadow, every strange reflection on the water could be the sign they were all waiting for. The minutes stretched into hours, and the bright moon climbed higher in the sky. The sailors stood at the rails, their hands gripping the wood, their bodies leaning forward as if to will the land to appear. The silence on deck was profound, a shared collective breath held in anticipation. The watch changed. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock in the morning, still nothing but the endless silver and black of the ocean. And then, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the night is at its darkest and coldest, it happened. From the forecastle of the Pinta, a single voice shattered the silence. A lookout named Rodrigo de Triana, his eyes raw from staring into the night, saw something that was not a cloud, not a wave, and not a phantom. Shimmering in the moonlight, about 6 miles ahead, was a distinct shape. It was a line of white, a cliff of sand or pale rock, and behind it, a dark mass that could only be land. He filled his lungs and let out a cry that had been held in the hearts of 90 men for 36 agonizing days, a cry that would echo through history. Tiara, tiara, land, land. The words shot across the water like a bolt of lightning. On the Pinta, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then an explosion of pure, unadulterated joy. Martin Alonso Pinthon, the captain, rushed to the rail, his experienced eyes confirming the sighting in an instant. It was real. He immediately ordered the firing of the prearranged signal. A cannon, a heavy iron lombard, was primed and lit. The resulting boom was a sharp, echoing crack that rolled across the silent water, a sound of thunderous triumph. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled, the sound of survival. On the Santa Maria and the Nina, the cannon shot confirmed the shout. All discipline, all semblance of order, vanished in an overwhelming wave of catharsis. The weight of more than a month of constant, gnawing fear was lifted in a single, glorious moment. Men who had been whispering of mutiny and murder just days before were now weeping openly. They embraced each other, shouting and cheering, their voices raw with emotion. Some fell to their knees on the hard wooden deck and gave thanks to God. Their prayers, a jumble of relief and gratitude. They had done it. They had sailed over the edge of the world and had come out the other side. They had not fallen off. They had not been eaten by monsters. They had not been lost to a wind that would never let them return. The mad Genoese had been right, after all. Their impossible gamble had paid off. Columbus, standing on his stern castle, heard the cry and the cannon. He soon saw the dark silhouette of the land for himself. In his journal, he would later make a controversial claim. He would state that because he had seen the mysterious light 4 hours earlier, he was the true first discoverer of the New World. He, and not the common sailor Rodrigo de Triana, was entitled to the lifetime annuity from the Queen. It was an act that would cause great bitterness and reveals a complex and less noble side of the admiral's character. But in that moment, such disputes were for the future. For now, there was only the shared victory. The Santa Maria and the Nina sailed up to join the Pinta and the 3 ships. The vessels that had been their prison and their salvation now hove to, waiting at a safe distance from the shore. They would wait for the sun to rise, to reveal the secrets of the world they had found. As the eastern sky began to lighten, shifting from inky black to a soft pre-dawn gray, the full shape of their discovery was slowly revealed. It was a small, low-lying island. It was not the grand golden-roofed palaces of Japan or the bustling port cities of China that Columbus had expected, but it was land, and it was beautiful. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, it illuminated a scene of breathtaking wonder. A beach of brilliant white sand sloped down to a turquoise sea of a clarity they had never seen before. Beyond the beach, the island was covered in lush, green vegetation, a dense forest of trees, of a kind they did not recognize. The air was warm and soft, and filled with the strange, melodic calls of exotic birds. After the monotonous, empty blue of the Atlantic, it was a vision of paradise. The time for waiting was over. Now they would set foot on this new shore. The ship's boats were lowered into the calm, clear water. Columbus prepared himself for the occasion. This was not just a landing. It was a ceremony of possession, a moment of profound historical significance. He dressed in his finest clothes, likely a scarlet doublet, a symbol of his rank as admiral and viceroy. He took with him the royal standard of Castile and Leon, a magnificent flag emblazoned with castles and lions. The Pinthon brothers, as captains, each took a boat as well, and they carried the official banner of the expedition, a white flag with a green cross, with the initials F and Y for Ferdinand and Jezebel on either side. A select party of armed men and ship's officers, including the royal secretary, Rodrigo de Escobedo, accompanied them. Their task was to bear witness and to officially record the act of possession for the Spanish crown. They rowed towards the shore, the dip and splash of the oars the only sound in the quiet morning. As they drew closer, they could see the incredible detail of the island. They could smell the rich, damp earth and the sweet fragrance of tropical flowers. The sounds of the birds grew louder, a chorus of unfamiliar music. Finally, with a soft, scraping sound, the hull of the lead boat slid onto the sand. Columbus stood up, and with the royal standard in his hand, he stepped out of the boat. For the first time, a European set foot in this new world. The feeling of the soft, warm sand under his boots, after 36 days on hard, wet, perpetually moving wooden decks, must have been an incredible sensation. It was the feeling of stability, of arrival, of reality. The other men poured out of the boats, some stumbling in their eagerness. Many of them immediately fell to their knees, kissing the ground, a deeply emotional act of gratitude and reverence. They had been delivered. Columbus gathered his officers around him. He planted the royal standard firmly in the sand, the brilliantly colored flag, a stark and foreign object against the backdrop of white beach and green jungle. He then gave a formal speech. In a loud voice, he claimed this island, which the natives called Guanahani, for his patrons, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He gave it a new name, San Salvador, Holy Savior, in honor of the God who had preserved them. The secretary dutifully recorded the entire proceeding, his quill scratching on the parchment, making the act official in the eyes of European law. This ceremony, conducted with great pomp and circumstance, and without any thought or regard for the people who already called this island home, marked the formal beginning of the Spanish colonization of the Americas. The Spaniards were not alone on their newfound shore as they conducted their ceremony, speaking a language the island had never heard. The island's true inhabitants emerged from the trees. They came silently, cautiously, watching these strange, pale, bearded beings with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They were the Taino people. In his journal, Columbus described this first encounter with a detailed and observant eye. He saw them as handsome and well-proportioned, with gentle faces and wide, curious eyes. They were, as he wrote, naked as their mothers bore them, their brown skin painted with geometric designs in black, white, and red. They carried no weapons of iron, only simple wooden javelins tipped with a fish's tooth. At first, they kept their distance, watching from the edge of the forest. Then, some of them grew bolder, with a few even swimming out to the great ships, which they must have regarded with utter astonishment. To the Taino, who had never seen anything larger than a dugout canoe, these vast wooden vessels with their towering masts and great white sails were an inexplicable marvel. They believed the ships and the men on them had come from the sky. They were people from the heavens. Columbus, for his part, was adamant that his men treat the natives with kindness and respect. He saw them not as enemies, but as potential subjects of the crown, and more importantly, as souls to be converted to Christianity. He gave strict orders that nothing should be taken from them by force. A peaceful, tentative first contact began. The Spaniards, seeing that the Taino were not hostile, approached them, offering gifts. They had brought with them the cheap trinkets they had packed in Spain, items they hoped would be seen as treasures. They offered the Taino bright red woolen caps, strings of colorful glass beads, and tiny brass hawksbells that made a cheerful, tinkling sound. The Taino people accepted these gifts with what Columbus described as incredible delight. The exchange was a moment of pure, world-altering connection, but also of profound misunderstanding. The Taino had no concept of the European obsession with commerce or ownership. They saw the exchange as a gesture of goodwill. In return for the trinkets, they offered the Spaniards what they had. They brought out brightly colored parrots, which they had tamed as pets. They offered large balls of spun cotton, a valuable commodity in Europe. And they gave the Spaniards their simple javelins. As he engaged in this silent, gentle trade, Columbus noticed something that made his heart beat faster. He saw that some of the natives wore small pieces of gold, crudely fashioned into rings, dangling from their noses. Gold, the ultimate prize, the very reason for the voyage. Through gestures and signs, he asked them where this gold came from. They pointed south, indicating that a great king on a larger island in that direction had vast quantities of the yellow metal. This peaceful first meeting on the beach of San Salvador was a brief, golden moment in history. It was a moment of mutual wonder, when two long-separated branches of the human family met on a quiet shore, regarding each other not with hostility, but with a deep and innocent curiosity. It was a moment before the devastating consequences of this encounter disease, slavery, and conquest would unfold and forever change the world. In his journal that night, Columbus wrote of the Taino with a strange duality. He described them as intelligent and gentle, remarking that with just 50 men he could subjugate them all and make them do whatever he wished. He believed they would make good servants and would be easy to convert to Christianity. And so, on a sun-drenched shore, the great voyage reached its end. The terror of the unknown ocean was replaced by the wonder of a new continent, and 90 weary sailors stood as witnesses to a world reborn. Here we'll let our main story rest in this quiet moment of discovery, long before the complexities of what was to come. If a particular moment in this first encounter sparked your imagination, please feel free to share your thoughts. For now, let the gentle waves of this new shore carry you into peaceful dreams. The world, for Christopher Columbus and his crews, had been remade. The frantic energy of that first landing, the sheer, heart-stopping relief of solid ground beneath their feet, had now softened into a new and quiet rhythm. The anchor had been weighed from San Salvador, but the destination was no longer a singular, desperate point on a map. It was everywhere. It was the endless possibility that stretched out before them, a scattered necklace of green jewels upon a turquoise sea. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not of frantic travel, but of gentle, meandering discovery. For the next 3 months, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina became wandering explorers in a world that felt like a waking dream. They drifted from one island to the next, each a new verse in an unfolding poem of creation. The pressing need to find land had been replaced by a different kind of hunger. It was a hunger for confirmation. Columbus remained utterly convinced that these were not new lands at all, but the forgotten outskirts of the grandest continent on earth. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was sailing through the archipelago of the Indies, the very islands that Marco Polo had described as lying off the coast of Cathay and Cipango. And so, the journey became a search, not for land, but for proof. He was looking for the gilded rooftops of a bustling city, the grand court of the great Khan, the source of the spices and silks that had fueled the European imagination for centuries. Each morning, the sun would rise, and the ships would glide through waters so clear they seemed to be floating on air. The men would line the rails, watching the bottom of the sea pass beneath them. A landscape of coral gardens and darting iridescent fish. On the horizon, another island would inevitably appear, then another, a soft, hazy green line that would slowly sharpen into focus, revealing white sands and dense, mysterious forests. They sailed along the northern coast of an immense island, a place of stunning beauty that the natives called Cuba. Columbus, in his conviction, believed it had to be a peninsula of mainland Asia itself. Further east, they encountered another vast and mountainous island, which he would name Hispaniola, the Spanish Isle, a place that would come to play a central role in the story of this new world. Today, this single island is home to two nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But to those first sailors, it was simply another piece of an impossibly large and beautiful puzzle. With each landing, a ritual was performed. A flag was planted in the soft sand, prayers were said, and a new name was given: San Salvador, Santa María de la Concepción, Fernandina, Isabella. The native names, spoken for generations, were brushed aside, replaced by the saints and symbols of a world away. It was a quiet act of possession, an imposition of one reality upon another, performed in the gentle lapping of the waves. Columbus was not just discovering a world, he was renaming it, reframing it in terms that he and his queen could understand. What truly captivated the admiral, beyond his quest for Asian courts, were the harbors. He was a mariner above all else, and he saw this new world through a sailor's eyes. His journal, a constant companion, filled with page after page of praise for the deep, calm waters he found. He wrote of natural harbors so large and protected that they could hold all the ships of Christendom without a single anchor. He saw the potential for trade, for future fleets to shelter and take on supplies. He saw the practical, strategic value of this earthly paradise. Indeed, paradise was the word that came to his mind over and over again. The air was warm and humid, but not oppressive. It carried on its currents the heavy, sweet scent of unseen tropical blossoms, a perfume that seemed to wash over the ships as they neared the shore. The rhythm of life slowed to the pace of the wind and the tides. They sailed by day, exploring coves and inlets, and often anchored at night, lulled to sleep by the gentle rocking of the ship and the distant chorus of nocturnal creatures from the jungle. The deep, verdant green of the forests was a constant presence, a wall of life that rose directly from the brilliant white of the sand, a stark and beautiful contrast that seemed almost too perfect to be real. To aid in this exploration, to bridge the immense gap of language and culture, several of the local Taino people were brought aboard the ships. They were not guests, but captives, taken to act as guides and interpreters. They pointed the way from island to island, their knowledge of the currents and channels indispensable. Through gestures and a growing collection of shared words, they began to paint a picture of the world as they knew it, a world far different from the one Columbus was searching for. Yet, even in this serene and methodical exploration, the fractures of the old world began to show. One day, the other captains looked to the horizon and found an empty space where a familiar sail should have been. The Pinta was gone, captained by the ambitious Martin Alonso Pinthon. The fastest of the three ships had simply vanished. For 6 long weeks, she remained separated from the fleet. No one knew for sure where she had gone. Was she lost? Had she turned back for Spain? Or, as many suspected, was Pinthon on a private, unsanctioned search for gold? hoping to claim the greatest prize for himself. The disappearance cast a subtle shadow over the expedition, a reminder of the human ambitions that sailed alongside the spirit of discovery. This period was unlike any that had come before or would come after. It was a moment suspended in time, a slow, methodical cataloging of a world untouched by European hands. It was an interlude of pure wonder, where every sunrise brought the promise of a new shoreline, a new species of plant, a new mystery to unfold. Each island was not just a different piece of land. It was a self-contained universe, an ecosystem teeming with plants and animals utterly alien to the sailors who watched from the decks of their small wooden vessels, their minds struggling to comprehend the sheer, boundless creativity of the world they had stumbled upon. As the ships glided from one shore to the next, the true richness of this new world began to reveal itself, not in gold or spices, but in the staggering abundance of life. The sailors, men accustomed to the familiar fields and forests of Spain, found themselves in a living laboratory of wonders. Every day brought a new sight, a new sound, a new taste that had no precedent in their collective experience. It was a land of constant, gentle surprises. One of the first and most curious discoveries was a plant the Taino people held in high regard. They would take its large, dried leaves, roll them into a tight cylinder, light one end with a hot coal, and place the other in their mouths. From this smoldering roll they would inhale the smoke, a ritual that seemed to bring them a sense of calm and focus. Columbus noted it in his journal with great curiosity, describing these rolls of tobacco as a strange local custom. He had no way of knowing he was the first European to document a plant that would one day conquer the globe, a simple leaf that would build fortunes and shape cultures far beyond these quiet shores. The skies themselves were a spectacle. The men were used to sparrows and pigeons, to the muted earth tones of European birds. Here, the air was filled with creatures painted in the most vivid hues imaginable. Flocks of parrots, a living rainbow of scarlet, blue, and emerald green, would burst from the canopy of the trees. Sometimes they flew in formations so vast and so dense that they would momentarily obscure the sun, their collective calls a raucous, joyful sound that echoed through the forest. The sight was so breathtaking, so utterly beyond anything they had ever imagined, that it felt like a scene from a fantastical tale. On the ground, they encountered other curiosities. The Taino kept small animals in their villages, creatures that resembled dogs, but for one startling fact, they did not bark. These quiet, domesticated companions were likely a species of mute dog, bred over generations to be silent hunters or peaceful pets. To the Spanish, accustomed to the constant barking of their own hounds, this silence was both eerie and fascinating, another small detail in a world that seemed to operate by a different set of rules. And then there was the food. The sailors' diet at sea was a monotonous rotation of salted meat, hard biscuit, and dried peas. Here, they were introduced to a banquet of new flavors. They tasted the sweet, juicy flesh of the pineapple for the first time, its spiky exterior hiding a taste so exquisite it seemed a gift from heaven. They were shown how to dig up the starchy roots of sweet potatoes, and how to roast the strange, golden kernels of maize, a grain that would become a staple food for millions around the world. The bounty of the land was overwhelming, a testament to its fertility and the skill of the people who cultivated it. Columbus, ever hopeful of finding the valuable commodities of the East, was constantly on the lookout for familiar plants. He was particularly fascinated by the large cotton plants that grew wild in many places. He watched the Taino women spin this cotton into fine, strong thread, marveling at its quality. He collected samples, convinced it would be a valuable trade good. On one island, he found a plant whose scent and appearance reminded him of the aloe plant of Asia, a highly prized medicinal spice. He identified it as such in his journal, a moment of hopeful misidentification in his relentless effort to fit this new world into his old maps. The wonders were not confined to the land. As they sailed through the warm, clear waters, the men would often see large, slow-moving creatures just below the surface. They had the gentle, curious faces and bulky bodies of sea cows. But to the sailors, raised on tales of mythical sea creatures, they were something else. Columbus described them as mermaids or sirenas, he noted with a certain scientific detachment. However, that they were not nearly as beautiful as the legends had painted them. They were more masculine in appearance, a pragmatic observation that captures the moment when myth collided with the mundane reality of zoology beneath the waves. A world of even greater diversity thrived. The coral reefs, visible through the impossibly clear water, were teeming with fish of every shape and color imaginable. It was a silent, bustling metropolis of marine life, more vibrant and crowded than any market in Seville. The crew would lower nets and lines and bring up creatures they had never seen before, each one a new marvel. Yet, for all this abundance, there was a notable absence. In Europe, the landscape was dotted with large animals. Horses, cows, sheep, and goats were a part of everyday life, beasts of burden and sources of food. Here, there were no such creatures. The lack of large mammals was one of the most striking differences, contributing to the sense of a world that was both wild and strangely gentle. Every new plant, every strange animal, every colorful fish was dutifully observed and recorded. Columbus understood that his mission was not just to find a trade route, but to report on the nature of the lands he discovered. These detailed botanical and zoological observations were a crucial part of his duty to the Spanish crown. A meticulous accounting of the wealth, not of gold, but of life itself, that he had found. The sweet taste of fresh fruit, the earthy smell of a field of maize, the smooth, waxy feel of a giant tropical leaf between his fingers. These were the true treasures of this initial exploration. And as the Spanish slowly catalogued the natural world, their attention turned more and more to the human world they had found, to the gentle people who lived in such profound harmony with this land of abundance. As the days turned into weeks, the Spanish began to make more detailed observations of the people who inhabited this apparent paradise. The initial encounters, filled with caution and wonder, gave way to a quiet, observational routine. The sailors learned that these people called themselves the Taino, and their society, while simple by European standards, was well ordered and deeply connected to the natural world around them. Their lives were lived in a way that seemed to the Spanish to be almost effortless, a gentle existence in a land that provided all they needed. The Taino lived in villages, often situated in clearings near the coast or along rivers. Their homes were not the stone and timber houses of Europe, but large, circular structures called bohios. These were built from wood and straw, with a tall, conical roof thatched with palm leaves. A single large bohio could house an entire extended family, a communal way of life that stood in stark contrast to the small family units of Spain. The air in these villages was often filled with the pleasant smell of wood smoke and cooking food, a scent of community and domestic peace. From the thatched roofs, a thin plume of smoke would rise, a gentle signal of life that the Spanish could see from their ships anchored in the bay. Their society was organized under the leadership of chieftains, whom they called caciques. These leaders were respected and obeyed, but they did not rule with the iron fist of a European monarch. They seemed to be more like revered elders or community organizers, guiding their people with wisdom rather than force. The Taino themselves were a people of many skills. They were accomplished farmers, tending to their fields of maize, sweet potatoes, and other crops with great care. They were also skilled potters, creating simple but beautiful earthenware vessels for cooking and storage. And they were master weavers, turning the cotton that grew so abundantly into hammocks, fishing nets, and simple cloths. Perhaps their most impressive creation, and the one most vital to their way of life, was the canoa. This was their primary means of transportation, a long, narrow boat carved from a single, massive tree trunk. The Spanish had never seen anything like it. Some of these canoes were small, for just a few people, while others were immense, capable of carrying dozens of warriors or an entire family on a journey between islands. They were propelled through the water with a smooth, rhythmic grace, the Taino dipping their polished wooden paddles in near-perfect unison. The word canoa was one of the first the Spanish adopted into their own language, a testament to the simple, effective genius of its design. It was from the Taino that the Europeans were also introduced to another marvel of practical comfort, the hamaca. These were woven beds made from cotton or other plant fibers, strung up between two posts or trees. The sailors, used to sleeping on hard, damp wooden decks or lumpy straw pallets, were immediately captivated. To lie in a hammock was to be gently rocked, as if in a cradle, suspended above the ground, away from dirt and crawling insects. The sensation was so soothing, so perfectly suited to a life at sea, that the Spanish quickly adopted the hammock for use on their own ships. It would become a standard feature on sailing vessels for centuries to come, a simple piece of Taino ingenuity that brought a small measure of comfort to the harsh life of a sailor. By all accounts, the Taino were a peaceful and generous people. Columbus wrote again and again in his journal about their open-handed nature. They seemed to have little concept of private ownership in the European sense. If a Spaniard admired one of their small golden ornaments, the owner would often simply give it to them, freely and without expectation of anything in return. They shared what they had with a generosity that both impressed and confused the explorers. They did, however, speak of others who were not so gentle. They told stories of a fierce, aggressive people who lived on other islands, a tribe they called the Caribs. According to the Taino, the Caribs were raiders and warriors who practiced the horrific ritual of eating their captives. This claim of cannibalism, whether true or exaggerated, is a subject of heavy debate among historians to this day. But to the Spanish, it was a chilling thought, a dark whisper that hinted that this paradise might have a more dangerous side. The Taino's spiritual world was also a source of fascination. Their religion was polytheistic, a complex web of beliefs centered on spirits known as zemis. These spirits could inhabit idols, trees, rocks, or other natural objects, and they played a central role in the health, fortune, and harvest of the village. It was a belief system woven into the very fabric of their environment, a stark contrast to the monotheistic certainty of their Christian visitors. And yet, as Columbus observed the Taino, he saw not just their gentleness and generosity, but also what he perceived as their timidity. He noted how easily they were frightened, how they possessed no weapons of iron, and how they seemed to have no inclination for war. He saw them as innocents, but also as a people who could be easily dominated, easily converted, and easily put to work. This perception, formed in these early days of peaceful observation, would have tragic and devastating consequences in the years to come. This period was defined by a profound and constant cultural misunderstanding. The Spanish saw simplicity and interpreted it as a lack of civilization. The Taíno saw visitors from another world and treated them with a mixture of awe and hospitality. From the decks of their ships, the sailors would watch Taíno children laughing and playing by the water's edge, their joyful sounds carrying across the calm anchorage. It was a scene of perfect, idyllic peace. But despite the tranquil beauty of this new world and its gentle inhabitants, the primary mission was never far from the admiral's mind. His peaceful observations were always paired with a constant, pressing question: where was the gold? The gentle rhythm of discovery, of cataloging new plants and observing a peaceful new culture, was about to be broken. The exploration of this seeming paradise had been marked by a sense of wonder and an almost dreamlike calm. But the sea, which had been so generous, was also a fickle and powerful master. As the year drew to a close, the expedition was about to face its first true disaster, an event that would irrevocably change the course of their journey. It was Christmas Eve, 1492. The Santa Maria and the smaller Nina were sailing along the coast of Hispaniola. The Pinta was still missing, a lingering source of anxiety for the admiral. The night was exceptionally calm. A gentle breeze pushed the ships slowly forward under a canopy of brilliant stars. The sea was as flat and smooth as glass, and the soft sound of water parting at the bow was the only thing that broke the profound silence of the night. Columbus, who had been awake for 2 days and a night, navigating the unfamiliar coastline, was utterly exhausted. Confident in the tranquil conditions, he finally retired to his cabin to rest. His decision was a reasonable one, but it set in motion a chain of fateful errors. The helmsman, who was given strict orders to remain at the tiller, also felt the heavy pull of fatigue. Seeing the calmness of the sea and the slowness of their pace, he made a reckless choice. He decided he, too, could sleep. He called over a young ship's boy, an apprentice sailor, and gave him charge of the tiller. This was a flagrant violation of one of the most fundamental rules of the sea. A ship was never to be left in the hands of a boy. The young sailor, perhaps proud of his new responsibility, did his best, but he lacked the experience to feel the subtle shifts in the current, the almost imperceptible changes that a veteran helmsman would notice instinctively. The ship, carried by a gentle but persistent current, began to drift silently and slowly towards the shore. No one noticed. The lookout in the crow's nest may have been dozing. The men below decks were fast asleep. And then it happened. The sound was not a violent crash, but a horrifying, grinding scrape. It was the sound of a wooden hull, the pride of the fleet, dragging across an unseen sandbar. The boy at the tiller shouted in alarm, and his cry woke Columbus, who was on deck in an instant. The ship was stuck fast. The gentle waves that had been so soothing now worked against them, pushing the Santa Maria further and further onto the reef. The frantic, chaotic energy of a crisis at sea erupted in the darkness. Men shouted orders, ropes were thrown, anchors were dropped in a desperate attempt to kedge the ship off the sand. But it was no use. The tide was falling, and the great vessel was settling deeper into its sandy trap. Soon, a more terrible sound was heard below deck. It was the splintering of wood, the groaning of the ship's timbers, as the seams of the hull began to open under the immense strain. Water began to pour into the hold. The Santa Maria, the flagship of this historic voyage, was dying. Columbus ordered the mast to be cut down to lighten the ship, but it was too little, too late. The vessel was hopelessly lost. As the gravity of the situation became clear, Columbus sent a small boat to the Nina for help. He also sent messengers ashore to the local Taino village. The chief of this region, a man named Gakinagari, responded with a compassion that stunned the Spanish. He did not see their misfortune as an opportunity. Instead, he sent all of his people out in their large canoes to help. Throughout the night and into Christmas morning, the Taino worked tirelessly alongside the Spanish sailors, unloading the ship's precious cargo. They brought everything: ashore barrels of wine, crates of supplies, cannons, and personal chest sand, guarded it all with such honesty that not a single item was stolen. In the morning light, the sight was a devastating one. The Santa Maria, the vessel that had carried all their hopes across the vast Atlantic, was a broken wreck, tilted at a sad angle on the reef. The waves washed through its breached hull. For Columbus and his men, it was a moment of profound loss and vulnerability. But as the admiral looked upon the wreckage, he did not see only failure. A devoutly religious man, he interpreted the disaster not as a random accident, but as a sign from God. He believed it was divine providence, a clear message that he was meant to establish a settlement in this very place. And so, a new plan was formed. Using the timbers from the dismantled Santa Maria, the Spanish began to build a small fort. The sounds of construction, the sawing of wood, the hammering of nails now filled the air of the quiet cove. It was the sound of the first European settlement being born in the Americas. They worked quickly, building a tower and a stockade, a small defensive outpost in this vast new world. Because the wreck had occurred on Christmas Day, Columbus named the settlement La Navidad, the Nativity. With the fort established, a pivotal decision was made. There was not enough room on the tiny Nina for all the remaining men to make the perilous journey home. And so, 39 men were chosen to stay behind. They were volunteers, tempted by the promise of gold. Their mission was clear: to explore the island, find the source of the Taínos' small golden ornaments, and gather as much of the precious metal as they could before Columbus returned. The loss of the flagship and the establishment of La Navidad marked the end of the initial phase of pure exploration. The fleet was now reduced to a single tiny caravel, the Nina. The prospect of the return journey across the ocean, a daunting enough task with 3 ships, now seemed incredibly precarious. The feelings of vulnerability and isolation must have been immense. With a final farewell to the men who would remain, Columbus turned his thoughts eastward towards the long and dangerous voyage home. He had to survive. He had to return to Spain to report the incredible world-changing findings of his journey. The gentle exploration of this newfound paradise concluded with a bittersweet farewell, leaving a small piece of Spain behind in the heart of a new world. This quiet interlude of discovery, a dreamlike chapter of lush forests and calm seas, now slowly fades. As these images soften, allow your mind to drift along with them, finding rest in the peaceful echoes of this forgotten time. Our journey across the ocean has reached its quiet conclusion. The shores of the New World have faded behind us, and the frantic energy of discovery has settled into a deep and lasting calm. Now, in this quiet space, let us drift back in time, not to retrace the voyage itself, but to gently explore the world that made such a voyage possible. Let us turn our attention to the silent partners of the journey, the ships, the tools, and the very beliefs that lived within the minds of the men who sailed them. This is a story of wood and wind, of stars and steel, of faith and of fear. Let us begin with the vessels themselves. The Santa María, the Pinta, and the Nina were not grand galleons or mighty ships of the line. They were small, sturdy, and profoundly capable. They were caravels, a marvel of 15th century engineering. Imagine one of them now, floating on a calm sea. It is a world unto itself, a small, self-contained island of wood, rope, and canvas, powered entirely by the invisible currents of the air. This remarkable design was not born in Spain, but was developed over decades by Portuguese mariners, who needed a vessel that could brave the Atlantic swells while also exploring the shallow, unpredictable coasts of Africa. The caravel was their answer, a ship built for the edge of the known world. Its genius began with its hull. The planks of the ship were not overlapped, as in older designs, but were laid edge to edge, creating a smooth, strong, and more efficient surface that cut through the water with greater ease. This method, known as carvel building, was a significant advancement. Furthermore, the hull had a shallow draft, meaning it did not sit too deeply in the water. This allowed the ships to venture into coastal shallows, to explore the mouths of rivers, and to get closer to unknown shores without the constant fear of running aground. It was a vessel designed for cautious, methodical exploration. And how was such a vessel controlled? At the stern, the back of the ship, was a large, heavy rudder, mounted centrally. This was a vast improvement over the older, less effective steering oars that were mounted on the side. This stern-mounted rudder gave the caravel a degree of control and responsiveness that was essential for navigating tricky waters. But there was no ship's wheel, that iconic image of a sailing vessel. That invention was still far in the future. Instead, from the top of the rudder, a long wooden pole, called a tiller, extended into the ship. The helmsman stood there, his hands on the worn, smooth surface of the tiller, physically pushing it from one side to the other. To steer the ship was a direct, tactile experience, a constant conversation between the sailor, the wood, and the water. Of course, the true engine of the caravel was the wind, captured by its magnificent sails. Here again, the design was a masterful blend of two different traditions. On the main masts, they flew large, square sails. These were powerful and effective when the wind was behind them, pushing the ship forward with steady, reliable speed. But on the rearmost mast, the mizzen, they carried a different kind of sail, a triangular one known as a lateen sail. This sail, borrowed from Mediterranean sailors, was incredibly versatile. It allowed the ship to sail much closer to the direction of the wind, providing a maneuverability that was crucial for tacking and navigating in and out of harbors. This combination of square and lateen sails made the caravel the perfect vessel for a long voyage into the unknown, capable of both making good speed in the open ocean and carefully exploring a strange new coastline. From the deck, you could look up and see an intricate web of ropes and rigging against the sky. On a calm night, the wind would hum through this web, a gentle, constant music that was the soundtrack of the sailors' lives. The forecastle at the front and the sterncastle at the back provided elevated platforms. From these small wooden towers, lookouts could scan the horizon for land, for other ships, or for the telltale signs of a gathering storm. They also served as defensive positions, small forts in the event of a hostile encounter. But life on the ship was not always so poetic. Deep in the bottom of the hull, in the dark space known as the bilge, a foul mixture of seawater, spilled wine, and other waste would collect. This bilge water was a constant threat, capable of rotting the ship's timbers from the inside out and breeding disease. Several times a day, men would have to work the heavy, clanking chain pumps, manually drawing the stinking, musty water up from the depths and casting it back into the sea. The smell of the damp bilge was a permanent feature of life below decks, a harsh reminder of the constant, grubby reality of keeping their wooden world afloat. And then there was the anchor, a critical piece of equipment that represented safety and rest. It was a heavy hook of forged iron with multiple flukes designed to dig into the seabed. It was connected to a thick, heavy cable made of hemp, a rope so rough and coarse that handling it would tear the skin from a man's hands. When the anchor was dropped, its rattling chain a welcome sound after a long day's sail, the ship was finally still. It was a moment of peace, a temporary connection to the solid world below the waves. Every part of this vessel, from the tallest mast to the deepest plank, was made from organic materials: wood, rope, canvas, and iron. It was a completely natural machine, a testament to the simple, robust technology that carried these men across the greatest of all oceans. These wooden vessels were the physical tools of discovery, but they were guided by instruments that interpreted the silent language of the heavens. In a quiet corner of the ship, away from the hustle and bustle of the crew, the navigator practiced his subtle art. Here, a few simple but beautiful tools were used to find a path across a featureless sea. This was the nerve center of the voyage, a place of quiet concentration. The most important tool, the one the sailors trusted above all others, was the mariner's compass. It was a simple thing of profound genius. A magnetized needle, balanced on a fine pivot, was housed inside a small wooden box. This box, called the binnacle, protected the delicate instrument from the elements. At night, a single flickering candle would be placed inside the binnacle, its soft light illuminating the compass card, which was marked with the 32 points of the wind. The needle itself seemed to possess a magical quality. No matter how the ship turned, no matter how chaotic the sea, the needle would tremble and float, but its point would always return faithfully to the north. Navigators knew that there was a slight difference between the magnetic north the compass showed and the true north of the pole star, a variation they called magnetic declination, but they did not yet fully understand its cause. They simply made adjustments based on experience and observation. To find their latitude, their position north or south of the equator, the navigators turned their eyes to the stars. On a clear night, the navigator would take out his quadrant. This was a quarter circle made of wood, or sometimes brass, with degrees marked along its curved edge. From its corner, a simple plumb line, a string with a weight, hung down. The navigator would stand on the rocking deck, a difficult and practiced skill, and sight the North Star along the top edge of the instrument. The plumb line, always pointing to the center of the earth, would hang across the markings, indicating the star's angle above the horizon. This angle, this simple measurement, told the navigator his latitude. It was a direct connection between the heavens and the ship's position on the vast, dark ocean. but what of time? On land, mechanical clocks were becoming more common, but their delicate pendulum mechanisms were useless on a constantly moving ship. The only reliable timekeeper at sea was the hourglass. It was a humble but essential device. Two glass bulbs, connected by a narrow neck, contained a measure of fine, dry sand. For 30 minutes, the sand would trickle from the top bulb to the bottom, a gentle whispering sound that marked the passage of a watch. When the sand ran out, a ship's boy would turn the glass over, ring a bell, and the cycle would begin again. This simple, steady measurement of time was crucial for regulating the duties of the crew and for attempting to calculate longitude through the complex and often inaccurate process of dead reckoning. The world of the navigator was also a world of charts. The maps of the time were called portolan charts. They were masterpieces of detail and accuracy for the known world. The coastlines of the Mediterranean and Western Europe were drawn with incredible precision, showing every harbor, every headland, every dangerous reef. But as these charts stretched west, out into the Atlantic, the detail simply stopped. The known world ended, and the rest of the chart was a terrifying, alluring blank. On this blank space, the navigator would use his dividers and a straight edge to plot the ship's course, a thin pencil line of hope drawn across an empty void. For work closer to shore, another simple tool was indispensable: the lead line. This was a long rope with a heavy lead weight on the end. The bottom of the weight was often hollowed out and filled with tallow or wax. When the line was dropped, it measured the depth of the water. When it was brought back up, the material stuck to the waxsand, mud, or shells would give the navigator a clue about the nature of the seabed. These few simple tools, the compass, the quadrant, the hourglass, and the chart, represented the pinnacle of navigational technology in their day. They were the instruments of a quiet science, practiced by a lonely navigator, working under the silent witness of the stars. The science of these tools gave the sailors a measure of confidence, but this confidence was constantly eroded by the powerful and deeply ingrained superstitions of the age. The blank spaces on their charts were not just empty in their minds. They were filled with the products of centuries of myth, rumor, and fear. To sail into the unknown was to sail into a world populated by monsters. Medieval maps, known as Mappa Mundi, were not just geographical documents. They were encyclopedias of the world as it was imagined. In the familiar regions of Europe and the Near East, they showed cities, rivers, and political boundaries. But in the unexplored oceans and distant lands, the cartographers would draw the creatures that were believed to live there. The margins of the map were filled with fantastical beasts, a visual representation of the terrors of the unknown. And so, as the sailors left the familiar coastlines behind, they were sailing directly into these monstrous territories. Tales of giant sea serpents were a staple of sailor lore. These were not just large eels, but colossal beasts, hundreds of feet long, capable of rising from the depths and swallowing a ship whole. Stories were told in hushed voices in the dark of the forecastle, tales of ships that had simply vanished, pulled under by these serpentine leviathans. Another common legend, one that originated in the cold waters of the north, was that of the kraken. This was said to be a squid-like creature of such immense size that its body could be mistaken for an island. When it rose from the abyss, its giant tentacles could wrap around a vessel and drag it to the bottom of the ocean. Other fears were more elemental. Sailors spoke of regions of the sea near the equator, where the sun was so hot that the water itself boiled a fiery barrier that no ship could cross. They whispered tales of magnetic mountains on the seafloor that were so powerful they could pull the iron nails right out of a ship's hull, causing it to fall apart in the middle of the ocean. It is a common myth, born much later in the 19th century, that people in Columbus's time believed the earth was flat. In truth, most educated people, and certainly all experienced mariners, knew that the world was a sphere. The ancient Greeks had proven it, and the evidence was plain to see for any sailor who watched a ship disappear over the horizon, its hull vanishing before its mast. The real debate was not about the shape of the earth, but about its size. Columbus argued that the earth was much smaller than most scholars believed, and that the ocean between Europe and Asia was therefore crossable. His opponents argued that the globe was much larger, and that the ocean was a vast, impassable void. And so, the sailor's true fear was not of falling off the edge. It was something far more psychologically terrifying. It was the fear of sailing too far to ever return. It was the fear of the point of no return, of running out of food and water in the middle of an endless ocean, doomed to drift under a merciless sun until the end of their days. These stories of monsters and boiling seas served as powerful cautionary tales, but they also reflected a genuine and profound lack of knowledge about the deep ocean. Any strange and unfamiliar sight could be fuel for these legends. A large whale, breaching suddenly near the ship in a shower of spray, could easily be mistaken for something more sinister. The eerie shapes of fog banks at dawn could be imagined as lurking creatures waiting in the mist. The unsettling feeling of sailing over an abyss, knowing that miles of black, crushing water lay beneath their thin wooden hull, was enough to stir the darkest parts of the imagination. Overcoming this deep psychological fear, this weight of centuries of myth, was one of the greatest and most unspoken challenges for every man in the crew. Alongside these fears of the monstrous and the unknown, the sailors carried with them a powerful shield, an invisible armor against the terrors of the deep. It was their deep and abiding faith. In the 15th century, religion was not a part of life. It was the framework of life itself. It explained the world, it gave meaning to suffering, and it offered the promise of salvation. For the men on this voyage, faith was as essential as the food they ate or the air they breathed. The expedition itself had a powerful religious motivation. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand saw it not just as a commercial venture, but as a holy quest. If a new, faster route to the riches of the East could be found, that wealth could be used to fund a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Furthermore, Columbus promised to carry the Christian faith to the unreached peoples of the world, to bring the light of the gospel to the lands of the Great Khan. The entire enterprise was wrapped in the language and purpose of a holy mission. This sense of divine purpose was reflected in the daily routines on board the ships. Life at sea was chaotic and dangerous, but it was given structure and meaning by religious ritual. Every evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the water, all work would stop. The crew would gather on the deck, their hats in their hands, for evening prayers. A ship's boy would lead them in the Articles of Faith and the Lord's Prayer, and then, together, their voices would rise in a hymn. They would sing the Salve Regina, a beautiful and ancient hymn to the Virgin Mary, the patron saint of sailors. The sound of their untrained but heartfelt voices singing together in the vast emptiness of the ocean was a profound act of community and hope. It was a ritual that brought a sense of peace and divine order to their uncertain world. Each ship sailed under the protection of a patron saint. The sailors would offer private prayers to these saints, asking for their intercession, for protection from storms, and for a safe return home. Many of the men wore simple religious amulets, a small wooden cross or a saint's medal tucked away beneath their rough woolen tunics. To touch this small object was a quiet, personal moment of reassurance, a physical connection to the protective power of their faith. In a world without modern science, natural phenomena were often interpreted as divine signs or omens. A sudden storm could be seen as a sign of God's displeasure, while a week of fair winds was a mark of his favor. One of the most dramatic of these phenomena was St. Elmo's fire during a thunderstorm. The atmospheric electrical charge could cause a bright, eerie glow to appear on the tips of the ship's masts. To the sailors, this was not a discharge of plasma. It was a holy sign, a visit from their patron saint, a promise that they would be protected through the storm. The sight of this strange, ethereal, blue-green light dancing on the masthead was a moment of terror transformed into a moment of awe and reassurance. Superstition mixed freely with faith. Dolphins swimming and playing in the ship's bow wave were always considered a good omen, a sign of a safe and swift passage. But certain seabirds, if they appeared at the wrong time, or certain patterns in the clouds, could be seen as harbingers of bad luck, casting a pall of anxiety over the entire crew. Columbus himself was a man of intense and personal piety. He saw himself not merely as an explorer, but as an instrument of God's will. He believed that his voyage was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, a step towards the end of the world and the final triumph of Christianity. This profound conviction was the bedrock of his certainty, the source of his unshakable resolve in the face of doubt and mutiny. It was a mindset that blended the scientific observations of his navigator with a deep, mystical faith. This complex inner world was the reality for every man on board, a constant interplay between what they could measure, what they believed, and what they feared. And with these quiet thoughts on the inner world of the sailor, our journey comes to its final, peaceful end. Our long voyage is now complete. We have sailed from the courts of Spain, across a terrifying and beautiful ocean, to the shores of a new world, and we have explored the very tools and beliefs that made such a journey possible. The sounds of the sea and the creaking ship have faded, leaving only a gentle quiet. Thank you for joining me, your sleeping scribe, on this adventure through history. Your presence here makes this community special, and if you've enjoyed our time together, a simple like or subscribe is always deeply appreciated. May your rest be deep and your dreams be peaceful. Until our next story, sleep well.